My name is Clara Mitchell, and when people see me today, they see a 32-year-old woman who runs a $20 million technology company with offices in 2 states and clients across the country. But the truth of how I got here is a story that still makes my chest tighten. I grew up in a house where discipline was not just a rule, but a weapon where mistakes were not corrected with guidance, but punished with humiliation and violence. My father, Richard Mitchell, was a professor who carried himself like a man who thought the world should bow at his feet. He loved the sound of his own lectures and the weight of his authority, and he expected everyone in our home to treat him like an unchallenged leader. My mother, Elaine, worked as a teacher, but at home she was silent, moving quietly, as if her only job was to keep the peace and to keep him calm. My younger brother Nathan was the golden child praised for every minor achievement lifted as the perfect heir to the Mitchell name. And me, I was always introduced as the one who had potential but never enough discipline, the one who should learn to be more like Nathan. I remember the night everything shattered as if the walls themselves never forgot the sound. I was 20 years old, sitting at the dinner table, my heart pounding as I prepared to say what I had been holding in for months. My father had laid out application forms for medical schools and law programs, his voice already rehearsing how he would boast to his colleagues about his brilliant children. He turned to me and asked coldly which path I had chosen. I looked straight into his eyes and told him with all the courage I could gather that I was not applying to any of them. I wanted to start my own business, a platform to help small artisans sell their products online. I had saved $4,000 and already built prototypes. For a moment, the room froze, forks suspended, Nathan smirking as if he could already taste my father's rage. Then it came. Richard's face darkened, his fist slammed on the table, and his voice cut through me like a blade. "Get out!" The words echoed sharp, unforgiving. When I did not move fast enough, when I sat trembling but steady, he stood, grabbed me by the shoulders, and shook me so hard my head snapped back. I remember the look in his eyes. Not fear, not disappointment, but disgust, as if I had just announced I was throwing my life into the gutter. He shouted again, his spit hitting my cheek. "Get out, you useless girl!" Before I could rise, before my mother could even gasp, his hand came down across my face. Then another blow caught the side of my skull. I fell my head, striking the corner of the wooden cabinet. Pain burst white, sharp, blinding. My ears rang, and the taste of iron filled my mouth. Nathan sat still smirking, while Elaine whispered, "Richard, please," but her voice was thin, powerless, drowned by his fury. Lying on the floor with blood dripping down my temple, I realized something would never change in that house. To my father, I would never be a daughter, only a failed project. I dragged myself up my head. Spinning vision blurred the words repeating in my mind like a curse. "You will never be anything." That night, I packed what little I could carry. My old laptop, a few clothes, and walked out of the front door while the house stayed silent behind me. No one followed. No one wished me luck. I left with blood crusting near my hairline and a new scar burning across my mind. Later, the doctors would call it a mild traumatic brain injury. To me, it was the final gift from a father who believed control was love. To understand how that night became inevitable, you have to know what it meant to grow up in the Mitchell household, where love was measured in grades and obedience, and where individuality was seen as rebellion. My father, Richard Mitchell, carried the weight of his position as a political science professor at the university, as if it were a crown, and he ruled our home like a kingdom, where he was king and no one questioned his decrees. He dressed each morning in pressed suits, even when he had no class, to teach his voice sharp and commanding, and every dinner conversation turned into a lecture about discipline and legacy. He told me more than once that the Mitchell family had to be a pillar of intellect and respect, a name spoken with admiration in faculty lounges, and that I had a duty to elevate it. He adored telling his colleagues about my younger brother Nathan, the brilliant boy who mastered debate tournaments and recited constitutional passages with flawless memory. At every gathering, Nathan was introduced with pride, while I was the afterthought, sometimes ignored, sometimes used as the example of what not to be. My mother, Elaine, was no less significant in shaping the atmosphere, though she never raised her voice. As the principal of a local high school, she believed rules prevented chaos, and in our home, she chose silence whenever Richard lashed out. If I complained about his harshness, she would whisper that he only wanted the best for us and that I should avoid provoking him. The message was clear: keep quiet and endure. There were nights when the three of us sat around the table and I felt like a stranger in my own family. My father's praise for Nathan flowed endlessly, his achievements repeated like sacred chants. Nathan was chosen to represent the school in national science fairs. Nathan was destined for Yale. Nathan was the future of the Mitchell name. Then the conversation would turn toward me, and my father would ask in that cold, detached tone whether I had improved my math scores or finally considered applying for medical school. If my answers failed to please him, the room would sink into heavy silence and my mother would clear her throat to change the subject. I learned to live with the invisible wall between me and them. Yet even behind that wall, I carried dreams they never wanted to hear. At 12, I built a simple website for a neighbor's flower shop and she received her first online order within days. At 16, I designed small online catalogs for local artisans. Those moments filled me with quiet joy, a sense of creating something valuable. When I showed my father, he dismissed it with a cold glance and said if I wanted to waste my time as tech support for shopkeepers, I should not expect his money. I smiled, but inside I felt the familiar sting of rejection. The pattern repeated endlessly. When Nathan made a mistake, it was explained away as the challenge of a genius mind, but when I slipped even slightly, my father's eyes burned with disappointment. My mother told me not to argue, not to embarrass the family, just to focus on fitting the mold he created. That mold had no space for a daughter who dreamed of building something new. The house itself seemed to carry the weight of his rules. Bookshelves lined with thick political volumes framed certificates covering the walls, silence broken only by my father's voice. I often sat at the kitchen window staring out at the street, wondering if other families laughed freely, wondering if somewhere else a father hugged his daughter instead of reminding her that she was an obligation. The truth is, the beating that left me injured was not born in a single night of anger. It was the final eruption of years of contempt of small cuts and subtle cruelties layered over time. Every withheld smile, every comparison to Nathan, every moment my mother chose silence carved the path toward that moment when my father's hand struck my face and his voice expelled me from his kingdom. In the Mitchell household, there was no space for difference, only control disguised as tradition. And in that pressure cooker of expectations and scorn, my choice to say no became not just defiance but treason. That is why the night he screamed, "Get out," and raised his hand, I already knew there was no returning. The roots of that toxic soil had long ago poisoned any chance of belonging. The night I left, I carried nothing more than a duffel bag with some clothes, an old laptop with a cracked screen, and the dull ache in my skull that pulsed with every heartbeat. The doctor at the emergency room had written mild traumatic brain injury on the chart and prescribed rest and medication, but rest was impossible when your father had thrown you out and your mother looked away. I walked out of the house with no goodbye, no blessing, no sign of regret from anyone who claimed to be family. The streetlights blurred as my head throbbed and the cold Oregon night wrapped itself around me like a shroud. I found a temporary bed at a friend's couch, but pride would not let me stay long. Within a week, I signed a lease for a one-room apartment in a crumbling building on the outskirts of Portland. The place smelled of damp wood and mildew. The heater rattled like an old engine, and the windows let in wind, no matter how tightly they were shut. Yet it was mine 400 square feet where no one barked orders or slammed fists on tables. The kitchen was so narrow that I could stretch both arms and touch the walls. I placed my second-hand desk under the only outlet and set up the battered laptop. That space became both prison and sanctuary. Each morning, I brewed cheap instant coffee, swallowed painkillers for the pounding in my head, and sat down to code websites for small clients I scraped from online boards. Some days I earned $50, some days nothing. Rent was due every month regardless. I picked up a job as a barista at a local cafe, waking before dawn to steam milk for strangers who barely looked at me, then rushing back home to send cold emails begging businesses to let me design their online presence. My diet collapsed into a cycle of instant noodles, canned beans, and boiled eggs. When the brain injury flared, I sat in darkness, clutching my temples, terrified that the pain would never ease, that maybe my father had been right when he said I would never be anything. Loneliness clawed at me. There were evenings I dialed my mother's number just to hear her voice, but when she realized I had not gone back to school, her response was sharp. Then, do not expect anyone to wait for you. After hanging up, I sat on the apartment floor for an hour, staring at the peeling paint on the walls, trying to swallow the truth that I had been erased from their lives. Still, I forced myself to keep moving. I printed cheap business cards at a corner shop, walked into local craft stores, and introduced myself. Some owners smiled politely and dismissed me once they learned I had no degree. One man even sent a laughing emoji after rejecting my email. Each rejection felt like my father's voice echoing, "Again, useless girl." Yet I refused to crawl back. I kept knocking on doors until two artisans agreed to work with me, Josie the soap maker, and Walter, an old wood carver who kept calling me Lucy by mistake. They paid me small amounts, barely enough to cover electricity, but their trust gave me a fragile thread of hope. For the first time, someone believed I could provide value. That thread kept me from collapsing completely. Still, the hardships piled up. 3 months in, while delivering a shipment for Josie, my old car stalled at an intersection after being rear-ended. The repair bill was $800 more than I had in my account. I walked home carrying boxes in the rainwater, soaking my jacket, teeth chattering, wondering if maybe I had chosen wrong, if maybe my father's blow had knocked not only my head, but also my sense. In my apartment, I sat surrounded by unpaid bills, the smell of wet cardboard filling the room, the pain in my skull throbbing again. I pressed my forehead to the desk and whispered, "What if I fail?" That night, something inside me cracked. I realized I could either accept the prophecy of my father or push forward with everything I had left. I chose the latter. With trembling fingers, I searched online for local entrepreneur meetups. I found a free event at the downtown library, a small business networking session scheduled for the following week. I told myself I would go, even if my shoes were worn, even if my jacket smelled of rain. Maybe I would meet no one. Maybe I would only sit in a room of strangers and feel less alone. But I knew I had to try because staying in that apartment drowning in silence would kill me long before the brain injury did. So with nothing but exhaustion and determination, I prepared to step into a room where my life was about to change. The evening of the library meetup arrived gray and wet, the kind of Portland night where the rain never fully stops, but lingers like mist clinging to every coat. I almost turned back twice on the walk from the bus stop because my head ached and my shoes leaked, and the thought of standing in a room filled with confident business owners made my stomach knot. But the alternative was returning to my apartment to the cold draft and the stack of unpaid bills. So I pushed open the library doors, wiped my damp hair from my eyes, and forced myself up the stairs to the community room. About 30 people were scattered around mismatched tables, sipping coffee from paper cups, chatting in low groups. I hovered near the wall, clutching the flimsy business cards I had printed for $20, terrified that my trembling hands would give me away. At the front stood a woman with silver hair tied neatly in a bun and eyes that seemed to pierce through the crowd. She introduced herself as Marianne Lopez, founder of a small but successful accounting software company. She spoke not with arrogance but with clarity, describing how she had grown from coding in her kitchen to serving hundreds of small businesses. Her words struck me because they were grounded in experience, not theory, and because, unlike my father, she never raised her voice to prove authority. When the session ended and people began drifting away, I hesitated. Part of me whispered that I should leave quietly before anyone noticed me. But another part, the stubborn fragment that had carried me out of my father's house bleeding and determined, pushed me forward. My palms were sweaty as I stepped toward Marianne and almost dropped my business card before I could place it in her hand. My voice shook as I said, "I am Clara Mitchell. I help artisans sell online. I have no degree, no funding, only a couple of clients, but I have real data, real revenue, even if small." She studied me in silence long enough that I thought she might dismiss me like everyone else. Then she smiled a simple but genuine smile and asked, "Do you have customer data?" Surprised, I opened my laptop and showed her the spreadsheets I had kept orders from Josie and Walter growth charts, modest but steady. She scrolled through, her eyes sharp but not condescending, and finally she said, You do not need more individual sellers, you need to think bigger. I frowned, not understanding, so, she explained. Instead of building websites one by one, why not build software for dozens of craft stores at once? You already have the skeleton of the model now, it is time to scale. The words landed like a door opening in my mind. No one had ever spoken to me as if I had potential worth expanding. My father's voice had always been, "You are nothing." But here was a woman who saw numbers on a screen and said, "You can grow." We sat on a bench outside the library under the drizzle and talked until the lights flickered inside. She told me about choosing markets, about focusing not only on artisans but on supply chains. Her advice was not sweet encouragement, but strategy, and that difference mattered. It meant she believed I could act on it. I walked back to my apartment soaked and shivering, but for the first time in months, the ache in my skull seemed lighter. I renamed my project Artisan Flow Solutions the very next morning. The old name had been too naive, too much like a side hobby. Now I had a plan. I wrote down goals on sticky notes and plastered them across the fridge. Pivot from small websites to scalable software. Target independent craft stores. Build order management and inventory systems. Sleep became scarce 3 hours some nights because I rewrote code until dawn and drafted cold emails to new prospects. Yet my exhaustion carried a new kind of energy, the fuel of direction. For the first time since leaving my father's house, I felt like I was not just surviving, but building. That night at the library had planted a seed of possibility, and though the soil of my life was rough and scarred, I was ready to let it grow. Renaming the project Artisan Flow Solutions gave me the illusion of confidence, but the reality was still brutal. My apartment looked like a war room, sticky notes covering the fridge and walls wires snaking across the floor from my aging laptop to a borrowed monitor. I coded during the day, rewrote entire frameworks, and at night I drafted long lists of potential clients. Most of them ignored me. Some replied with polite rejections. Others laughed when I admitted I had never gone to college. One message simply read, "Good luck, dropout," followed by a smiley face that stung more than any rejection letter. Rent consumed half of what I earned at the cafe. Utilities and food devoured the rest. My diet shrank to instant ramen and cheap bread. Some nights the pain in my head returned so sharply I lay curled on the thin mattress, whispering to myself that I would survive this, that I had to prove my father wrong. Still, I pushed forward. I walked into shops holding my laptop under my arm, showing demos of an unfinished product. Most owners smiled politely, then asked if I had credentials. When I said no, they turned away. The humiliation burned, but I told myself humiliation was temporary. I scraped together enough money to attend a small craft fair and rented a corner booth. I displayed a simple screen showing how Artisan Flow could track orders for a store. Children pressed buttons on the screen while parents glanced at me with indifference. Out of dozens of passers-by, only one woman stopped Josie the soapmaker, who already trusted me. She nodded and said if I built her a full system, she would pay $20 a month. $20 meant little, but to me it was survival. Walter, the old woodcarver who called me Lucy, added another subscription. Between the two of them, I paid my electric bill and avoided eviction by a week. Still, the numbers did not add up. I sat many nights staring at overdue notices, the dread curling in my stomach like acid. Then came the crash. One February morning while delivering for Josie, my battered car was rear-ended at an intersection. No one was injured, but the vehicle refused to start again. The repair shop quoted $800. I had $200 in my account. I walked home carrying boxes in the rain, my arms aching, shoes soaked, wondering if my father's curse had been right all along. In the apartment, the walls seemed to close in on me, the smell of damp cardboard filling my nose. I pressed my forehead against the desk and sobbed. I thought about crawling back to them, begging, swallowing my pride. But the memory of his voice, "Get out," slammed back like a door, and I knew there was nothing to return to. Either I built this or I disappeared. So I kept going. I applied for small business grants, none approved. I cold called over 100 stores, 99 hung up. Yet one chain of handcrafted furniture stores finally answered. Maple and Sage, with 36 locations across 6 states, had outdated software and asked me to send a demo. I worked with Jake, a young UX student I met at a community meetup who agreed to help for a small stipend and meals. We built the demo in 5 sleepless days, coding at the kitchen table using boxes of noodles as makeshift desks. My head throbbed with every keystroke, but I forced myself through. When the call came back from their operations director, Rebecca Tran, her voice was firm. "We need this deployed in 60 days. Can you deliver?" I looked at Jake, his thumbs up shaky but determined. I said yes. The first meeting with their team was terrifying. I wore a borrowed blazer and shoes that pinched, sat in a glass office with automatic coffee machines, and felt like an imposter. But when the technical questions came, I answered with precision carved from months of struggle. They signed a contract worth $420,000 with $150,000 up front. When I stepped out of that office into the cold air, I clutched my backpack like it contained an entire new life. For the first time, money flowed not from desperation, but from value. With that contract, I paid off debts, hired Jake part-time, and upgraded our equipment. Soon after, Maple and Sage referred us to 3 other chains. A craft materials supermarket in California signed for $630,000. Each deal pulled me further from the shadow of failure. By the end of the second year, Artisan Flow employed 5 full-time staff in a rented office in Beaverton. We served over 20 chains, revenue climbing steadily. Yet even as success surrounded me, I could not forget the nights of hunger, the ache in my skull, the sound of my father's voice. The struggle had burned itself into me like a scar. It taught me that victory tasted best only after swallowing years of bitterness. By the 3rd year, Artisan Flow was no longer just a desperate idea scribbled on sticky notes. It was a company with real offices, glass windows that looked out over busy streets, and a team that filled the space with the hum of keyboards and the smell of takeout lunches. Revenue passed $1.2 million, net profit cleared $300,000, and for the first time, I paid myself a salary that allowed me to breathe. Reporters started calling curious about the woman who had built a multi-million-dollar business without a degree, without investors, without family support. Tech magazines printed my photo under headlines like "Dropout builds supply chain software for small retail chains." At conferences, I stood on stages and spoke about building tools for artisans, about resilience, about nights of coding in a tiny apartment with broken heaters. People clapped, shook my hand, asked for advice. Out in the world, I had become someone. Yet in the Mitchell household, nothing had changed. Each month or 2, I received a call from my mother, Elaine. Her voice was polite but distant, her words always drifting back to Nathan. "Your brother has been accepted into Yale. Nathan just published a paper with his professor. Nathan is applying for fellowships." Each update was delivered like a polished jewel, while I was offered nothing more than a pause, as if she had run out of small talk. Not once did she ask about Artisan Flow. Not once did she mention the articles with my face on them. I listened quietly, smiled into the receiver, though she could not see, and said little more than "I am glad he is doing well." The ache that followed those calls was not rage, but a dull reminder that in their eyes I was still the failure who had walked out. The contrast was absurd. On Monday, I could sign a contract worth 6 figures on Tuesday. My mother could call and ask if I had considered going back to school to make something of myself. I wanted to scream that I already had, that the world knew me even if they refused to. But I swallowed the words. I knew they would not hear them. Sometimes at night, I scrolled through online forums where strangers discussed my company, praising its design or criticizing its flaws, and I thought how odd it was that anonymous people respected me more than my own blood. The silence from them cut deeper than the insults of competitors. My father, Richard, remained as impenetrable as stone. He never called, never wrote. Through neighbors, I heard he still introduced himself proudly as Professor Mitchell and spoke of Nathan as his brilliant son. When asked about me, he waved dismissively and said she is dabbling in computers, dabbling as if contracts worth hundreds of thousands were no more significant than a crossword puzzle. The hypocrisy burned because I knew he read the same newspapers that printed my face. He chose to ignore the evidence because acknowledging it would mean admitting he was wrong. For a man like him, that was unthinkable. At family gatherings, I stopped attending, but one Thanksgiving I allowed myself to appear curious whether success would soften their stance. I walked into the house with a bottle of wine and a cautious heart. The smell of roasted turkey filled the air. The table was set with polished silverware, and for a moment I let myself hope. But as dinner began, the script repeated. Elaine raised a toast to family unity. Richard delivered a speech about Nathan's accomplishments, his promising career, his contributions to academia. Matthew, Nathan's friend, was praised for his supportive nature. My name was not spoken once. I sat silent as I had done countless times as a child, the outsider at the table, where only one child truly belonged. The sting was sharper because I knew what I had achieved. I knew the valuation of my company was $20 million, that my employees depended on me, that strangers admired me. Yet in that dining room, I was still the failure. My brother smirked when I tried to speak, cutting me off with a joke. My mother shushed me softly, saying, "Let us not ruin the evening." My father's eyes flicked over me like I was invisible. That night, I drove back to my apartment not in tears, but in a silence heavier than any storm. Success had carried me out of poverty and despair, but it had not bought me recognition from the people whose approval I once craved. The lesson settled into me slowly. Some wounds do not heal with money or applause. Some people will never see you no matter how brightly you shine. Still, I kept shining. I expanded Artisan Flow into new markets, opened a second office, hired more staff. Outwardly, I thrived. Inwardly, the gap between who I had become and who they insisted I was grew into a canyon. And in that canyon, anger brewed quietly, waiting for the moment it would rise to the surface. By the time Artisan Flow reached its 5th year, the valuation crossed $20 million and our client list stretched across multiple states. I had more employees than I could remember by name, and a schedule filled with conferences and negotiations. Yet inside me there was an unsettled weight, a part of me that still carried the bruises from that night my father had screamed, "Get out," and struck me until my head split. I had built an empire from the rubble he left me in, but every phone call from my mother that reduced me to silence reminded me that in their world I was still nothing. That November, when Thanksgiving approached, I decided it was time to stop swallowing their contempt. I would not shout or beg. I would confront them with facts with undeniable truth and then cut the cord. I arrived at the Mitchell home just before dinner, carrying a neat leather folder filled with documents, printouts of contracts, valuations, and magazine covers with my face on them. I also carried years of silence ready to be broken. The house looked the same. The brick walls that had once closed in on me, the smell of stuffing drifting through the air, my mother, Elaine, bustling in the kitchen, my father, Richard, sitting tall in his chair with the newspaper folded beside him, Nathan leaning against the doorway wearing a smug grin. They greeted me with polite nods as though I were an acquaintance, not blood. Dinner began with ritual. Elaine raised a toast to health and family unity. Richard delivered a long speech praising Nathan's academic achievements and his bright future. Guests clapped. Nathan smirked, and my name never surfaced. When the plates were passed around, I laid the folder on the table. "I would like to share something," I said. My mother frowned as if I had spilled wine on her tablecloth. Nathan rolled his eyes. Richard narrowed his gaze. I opened the folder and placed a glossy magazine cover on the table. Across it, in bold letters, were the words, "Dropout CEO reshapes retail supply chains." My picture filled the page, smiling, confident, successful. "Where did you get this?" my father asked, his voice icy. "From my own life," I answered. "This is me. I built Artisan Flow Solutions from the ground up. We employ over 80 people across 2 offices. We serve dozens of retail chains. Our valuation is over $20 million. The room froze. My mother's fork clattered against her plate. Nathan laughed a sharp, mocking sound. "You expect us to believe this? A girl with no degree builds a company worth millions." My father's face turned red, his fists curling. He slammed the table. "Enough! Do not insult our intelligence with fantasies. You are a fraud, a disgrace." His words sliced at me, but I no longer flinched. I pulled out contracts, bank statements, employee rosters. I spread them across the table one by one. These are real. These are signed. These are audited. I am not a fraud. I am the provider you never acknowledged. Do you remember when your mortgage was mysteriously paid for several months? That was me. Do you remember when Nathan's tuition was covered after a delay? That was me, too. I kept this family afloat while you scorned me. Elaine's face drained of color. She whispered, "Was it really you?" I nodded. "And it ends tonight." Richard's chair scraped back violently as he stood. His voice thundered, "You dare stand in this house and claim you rescued us! We needed nothing from you. We survived without you." His denial was almost laughable. I looked at him and said, "You survived because of me, and you never knew because I never asked for gratitude. But I will no longer fund a family that sees me as dirt. From this day forward, every transfer stops. Pay your own bills. Fund your own illusions." Nathan sneered. "You think cutting us off makes you powerful. You are still the same weak girl who ran crying." My voice stayed steady. "The weak girl you remember turned pain into a $20 million company. The weak girl you dismissed employs more people than you will ever teach, and she is done." My mother reached out her hand, trembling. "Clara, please, what about next month's support? What about my medication?" My chest tightened, but I did not bend. "Mom, people who call me a disgrace cannot keep living off my money." Her eyes welled with tears, but I held firm. Richard roared, "Get out! Get out again!" This time, I rose calmly, gathering the folder, sliding each document back inside with care. I looked at him one final time. "The last time you shouted those words, you left me bleeding on the floor." I walked away, broken but determined. Tonight, I walk away whole. Keep your house of denial. I will not step back inside. Silence followed me as I moved to the door, but behind me, the empire he worshipped, the perfect son, the obedient wife, all sat in shambles because the truth had been thrown onto their table like shards of glass. Days later, I heard through a neighbor that my father's mortgage fell into arrears. Within months, the bank issued foreclosure. Nathan withdrew from Yale temporarily because tuition was unpaid. Elaine scrambled with medical bills without the quiet safety net I had provided. The consequences were swift and undeniable. They had lived cushioned by the very daughter they called useless, and now they faced reality without her. I felt no guilt. Justice had arrived not through fists or shouts, but through exposure and withdrawal. For years, they had taken my silence as weakness. That night, I showed them it was strength. They could scream fraud all they wanted, but the bank statements and the eviction notices screamed louder. In the weeks that followed, I slept lighter, breathed deeper. Revenge was not fire and spectacle. It was truth revealed and support withdrawn. And for the first time, I felt free from the chains of their disdain. After that Thanksgiving, I never set foot in the Mitchell house again. The silence that followed was not empty but liberating. For years, I had carried the echo of my father's voice telling me I was worthless, the whisper of my mother urging me to stay quiet, the smirk of my brother whenever I tried to defend myself. Cutting the financial cord severed those echoes. They still existed, but they no longer owned me. I moved into a modest house near the California coast, not a mansion, but a home filled with light with windows that opened to the sound of waves instead of the pounding of fists. I cleared out every piece of furniture from my old apartment and replaced it with what felt like a new beginning. Artisan flow continued to expand, and with each contract, each hire, I felt my life stretching further from the night I had stumbled out of my parents' house bleeding. I decided to create the Clara Foundation, a grant and mentorship program for young founders without college degrees, those who carried big ideas but no pedigree. I wanted them to know what I had not known at 20, that failure in the eyes of family does not equal failure in life, that being cast out does not mean you cannot carve your own place. The applications poured in nearly 500 in the first 6 weeks. I read them late at night with tears in my eyes, recognizing the fear and hunger in their words. The first grant went to a young woman from Texas who wanted to build a scheduling system for small clinics. She cried during our video call, telling me she had not expected anyone to pick her when her resume listed only high school. I told her perhaps she had not met the right reviewer until now. Supporting her felt like healing the wounded girl inside me. Outwardly, my life looked polished, filled with boardrooms and conferences, but my truest satisfaction came from those moments of giving others the belief I had once lacked. Meanwhile, the consequences for my family unfolded quietly. Their home was repossessed. Nathan took a leave from Yale. Richard accepted odd consulting work but never regained his stature. Elaine tried to call twice, her voice heavy with something between apology and need, but I did not answer. I was not cruel, but I had boundaries now. I had built too much to let them drag me back. And yet, as time passed, anger softened into clarity. I realized that forgiveness was not about excusing them, but about freeing myself from the weight of hating them. So one day, when I was tending to lavender in my garden, my phone rang with a number from Oregon. Against instinct, I answered. It was Nathan, his voice stripped of arrogance. He said simply, "Clara, I did not see before I was blind. I am sorry." I stood there silent, letting the ocean wind fill the gap between us. I told him I appreciated his words, but that my life was no longer tied to theirs. He said he understood. That was enough. Later, a letter arrived from Richard. His handwriting was shaky but clear. He wrote that he had been wrong, that his pride had blinded him, that when I laid the truth on the table that night, he felt his world collapse. He admitted he had failed as a father. I read it more than once, searching for manipulation, but what I found instead was a man stripped of certainty. I did not cry, but a knot loosened in my chest. I sent a postcard back. "Thank you for writing. I am building the life I always dreamed of. If you wish to be part of it, the only condition is respect." I did not return to Oregon. I did not invite them to my home. But I allowed space for a new definition of family, one built on chosen bonds. Every Sunday night, I hosted dinners in my backyard. String lights glowed above a long table, bread-baked fresh wine shared among colleagues and friends. There was Jake now, a full-time partner at Artisan Flow. There were young founders from the Clara Foundation, their eyes bright with ideas. Sometimes there was Marianne the mentor, who had once paused long enough to see value in me. Around that table, we did not talk about titles or pedigrees. We talked about resilience, about choices, about building lives that mattered. That community became my true family, chosen not by blood, but by belief. Looking back, I realized something important. My story was never about revenge against Richard or about proving him wrong. It was about proving myself right, about refusing to let his violence be the final word. The brain injury he left me with still flared, sometimes headaches reminding me of that night, but instead of breaking me, it became the scar that testified to survival. I did not forgive him because he changed. I forgave so I could walk lighter, freer, and for the first time, I was not moving forward to prove anything. I was moving forward because I was already whole. When I speak now at events, I tell my story without embellishment. I tell them sometimes the best thing you can do is stop begging for love from those who refuse to see you. Healing is not about their apology. Healing is about refusing to endure anymore. When I end, the rooms often fall silent, and then the applause rises. I watch faces older than mine, people who have carried decades of family pain, nodding with tears in their eyes. They see themselves in me. They see that it is never too late to claim freedom. And I ask them the same question I now ask you. Would you dare to live your truth, even if it meant walking away from the people who raised you?